All right, all you econ people. Well, today's installment of the lecture hall is going to be about the topic of the national debt. Now, as I mentioned in the Schoology page, this is stuff that just isn't covered by Chapter 12 and is part of this unit. So you want to make sure you're kind of watching this whole thing because we're giving you stuff that's not here in the chapter. So let's talk about the national debt. Kind of like we talked about the GDP back in Unit 3 when we started the unit. We said if we're going to talk about the gross domestic product, well, let's know what it is. What is that number? So let's do the same thing for the national debt. The national debt as of 2 days ago on March 17th to the penny, according to the Treasury Department, was that number. $23.5 trillion. That's a lot of money. And you might say to yourselves, oh my God, that has to be the biggest national debt in the whole world. It is and it isn't. As far as the actual number, sure, that number is the biggest national debt in the whole entire world. But if you remember the concept of proportionality from the last unit, we've got the biggest national debt, but we're also the biggest economy in the world. And so that's how you measure the size of a national debt to compare countries to each other. It's called the debt-to-GDP ratio. And it's a way of bringing proportionality in. Just like knowing how expensive something is for somebody requires that you know how big their pie of income is, and smaller pies, stuff is more expensive. Well, by the same token, if you actually look at the debt-to-GDP ratio, meaning take the national debt and then divide it by the GDP of the country. Do you remember the GDP from last unit? It's $21.7 trillion. Well, if you take a number like that and divide it, you get 108%. So 108% is the adjusted size for our proportional way of measuring the economy, I guess you would say. And this would be the number that you would compare to other countries around the world. So, for example, how does that compare to other countries around the world? Well, number one, it would show you we're not the biggest national debt in the world. The biggest national debt in the world is Japan, coming in at over 253%, meaning their national debt is more than double what their GDP is. And admittedly, they are an outlier. Just to find second place, you'd have to drop about 70 percentage points and look at the country of Greece, which is at 181% of its national debt. And those are even outliers because even getting down to third place, Italy, somewhere in the 130% and such, these are definitely the two biggest debt-to-GDP ratios in the whole entire world. So maybe you start to get the idea, oh, well, we're at 108%. That doesn't look so bad. Well, it doesn't look so bad compared to the outliers, but we're still in something like the top 15 debt-to-GDP ratios in the whole world. Matter of fact, if you want to take a look at the countries of the European Union, I'm not saying the European Union's debt, I'm saying the average debt of all the countries in the European Union is only at about 81%. So yeah, America does have a high debt problem. There's no doubt about that. An economist says anything over 100% is a serious, although not critical problem. The critical problems come when you get up into ranges like these. So we're not there. That's, I suppose, good news. Let's take a little look at the history of how we got here, at least the recent history. Now, the first thing you might notice here on this screen is this source, Fred. And you might go, okay, who's Fred? How do we know this is anything that's good? Well, that's actually an acronym for the Federal Reserve's Education Division. They think that's funny. I kind of think it's kind of funny, too, to just call themselves Fred. We'll be talking a lot about the Federal Reserve in the next unit on monetary policy. We've already made a little bit of reference to it. But this is the Central Bank of the United States. They are one of the premier information sources on economic information in the country. And that's why it surprises me that they did something that I hate when people do with graphs. Now, we've talked in our problem sets about how it's okay to have a break in the graph, to save space on your graph so that you don't have a whole lot of extra blank space that isn't necessary. But that always has to be judged against what is the information that you're trying to convey. If you take a look at this scale that's over here on this side, it starts at 30. And in this case, I don't consider that a legitimate use of a break in the graph. Because what we're trying to convey is the size of the national debt, and doing this makes it look like it used to be almost nothing 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. That's not true at all. So one of the things that I can do with the PowerPoint is fix this graph for you to show you what it really looks like. Going all the way back 40 years ago to 1980, well, the GDP ratio back then was around 30%. Not zero. It wasn't insignificant back at the time. But, yeah, as you can see, between that time, as you go up this whole graph, we've like tripled the debt ratio just over the course of, say, my lifetime, for example. It starts growing in the 1980s, continues growing into the 90s, drops off during the 2000s, and climbs some more. But this right here, as you might have guessed, is the 2007, 2008, 2009 recession that made this whole thing skyrocket and gets us to the level that we continue to be at today. So, just over the last 40 years, this has been the real growth of our national debt. Looking at a graph of the numbers, it would just go like that. But the real debt-to-GDP ratio shows a different story. Now, another thing that's important about the national debt, the last thing that's important about the national debt that we'll talk about this morning, is you have to know the number that you're talking about. This graph here that comes from Fred could be compared to this graph here that comes from NPR, National Public Radio. They're certainly not an economic source, but they're a reputable source besides. And if you take a pretty good close look at this graph, number one, it goes back a lot further than Fred's. It goes all the way back to World War II when our debt-to-GDP ratio was about that high. But just as importantly, they're saying that in 2009, we were at a 53% ratio. And Fred just told us that in 2009, we were at about an 80% ratio. So which of them is right? Well, the answer is they're both right, depending on which number you want to look at. You see, Fred's number is the total public debt. And the total public debt just means, what does the Treasury owe? That's a pretty standard way. As a matter of fact, it's my preferred way to look at it because I think it tells the best story. It tells the whole truth about how much money the government has been borrowing. But this is also, dang it, an accurate number because, well, one of the subjects of a later lecture is going to be, to whom do we owe all this money? And one of the answers is the government owes some of it to itself. You say, how can that be? Well, one of the biggest examples is the Social Security Trust Fund. That money that the government has set aside for future Social Security payments has been borrowed to pay for some of the spending that we have today. And so, in a sense, the government is taking money out of one pot and putting it into another pot. A common analogy that's used is that we're taking it out of our left pocket and putting it into our right pocket. And sometimes people say, well, you shouldn't count that because government that money owes itself is basically a wash. We only want to know about the amount of money that is owed to other entities that are not the government. So sometimes that's called the net debt. If you remember that expression net from last unit, it means something minus something else. In this case, it's the total government debt minus the part that the government owes itself. So it's a perfectly valid way of looking at the national debt. I don't like it as much because it's always a much smaller number and it doesn't show the extent of the borrowing, but you could use either number if you want. Now the final bit of this little lecture hall today is going to show you this gray area here. See this projected area is what they say. They were predicting back at the time what would happen. That it was going to rise a little bit more, and then the government would be good and responsible and just keep everything steady. Well, number one, we know you can't really trust the government to do that. And number two, this final year here is 2019, once I get my finger in the right place. And we actually have data now since this graph was created. That's where we really are today. A bit off the projection line, that's for sure. Over the course of the last decade or so, the debt-to-GDP ratio of the United States has steadily risen like this. And if you want to use this statistic, this is the true story of where we are today using this other way of measuring the GDP. So I guess the final thing that we're going to say on the GDP today is it's always very important that you know which statistic you're looking at. You don't ever look at the national debt. You look at the debt-to-GDP ratio. And once you find it, you've got to know, is it the total or is it the net? That's today's Economic Lecture Hall.